Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am very glad that you can join us for the fifth PTRC Fireside Chat. Just a quick introduction to PTRC. We are a leading organizer of training and events within the transport profession, and we're part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, or CILT, as most of you would know them. They are the leading membership body for professionals dealing with the movements of goods and people. I'm really looking forward to today's chat. We have an amazing lineup. Thanks everyone for joining us. And of course, thanks to Glenn for helping me organize during the chaos that is TPM this time. And of course for chairing. So I'll hand it over to you, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Brogan. And good afternoon, everyone. My name's Glenn Lyons. I'm the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at the University of the West of England in Bristol. And I'm delighted to be chairing, as Brogan says, this fifth fireside chat in the series since the pandemic began. Very warm welcome to all of you out there as our audience who've joined today. I'm sure others are still coming in, but we had around 300 registrations for the event, which I think is a nice reflection of the strength of feeling and interest in this important topic. For those of you on YouTube, please make use of the chat window during the session, both to share your views and raise questions that you'd like the panel to try and address. And incidentally, a warm welcome too if you're watching this later as a recording. Well, we really do have an excellent panel here for you this afternoon, and we'll be hearing their opening remarks shortly. But I'd like to set the scene before that. So cast your minds back to the 23rd of March when the UK went into lockdown. We were permitted one form of exercise a day outside the house. Roads became quieter. The air was cleaner. Birdsong was a sign of nature growing back, we were told. Walkability was improved, and walking in turn proved popular alongside cycling. Over the 6 months since lockdown began, the headline issues for transport, it seems to me, have included the plight of public transport and temporary reallocation of road space, particularly for cycling, in the absence of motor traffic, and the hope that a different and better new normal for mobility might emerge. Walking seems, by comparison, to have been treated as a footnote in proceedings. Am I being fair in that observation? Well, we'll hear from our panelists in due course. Now, a few weeks before lockdown, Transport Scotland published its new National Transport Strategy. And I do commend that to you as a document, not least because it commits to embedding the sustainable travel hierarchy in its decision-making. Walking and wheelchair use are at the top of the hierarchy. Walking matters. Mind you, beware of any notion that such a hierarchy has universal support. When it comes to low traffic neighbourhoods and developments during the pandemic, there seems to have become a veritable battleground on hierarchy where it's encroaching on the car. I won't attempt to recall what the lockdown rules were back in July, but this was the month when the Department for Transport published Gear Change, a bold vision for cycling and walking. Great news for active travel, perhaps indeed an important part of shaping this new normal that is much talked about. But in terms of walking, well, the clue is in the title, really. Much more of a gear change than a step change. From its title to its table of contents, to the foreword and then into the substance, this is ostensibly a vision about cycling with a smattering of mentions of walking for good measure, it felt to me. Yet, of course, as we know, nearly everyone can walk and does walk, while not everyone is so readily able to cycle. If we're wanting to foster a renaissance in active travel to help realise positive social outcomes, then the barriers to walking are lower than for cycling for most people. The vehicle I need is probably in my wardrobe. I don't need to buy a bike or wait for the cycle hire scheme that I may feel awkward about using. In fact, the vast majority of people, of course, already walk. It's not a new behaviour. It's simply a behaviour with the right encouragement and improvement to the walking environment that needs to be performed more. So I ask, when can we expect step change, a bold vision for walking? Well, move forward another month into the pandemic, and on the 31st of August, the Department for Transport launched a public consultation on pavement parking in England with 3 options to consider. This, I should say, is in the context of a nationwide ban coming into force in Scotland next year. Emphasis, if you've had a look at it in the consultation document, is on wheelchair users, people with visual impairments, and those with prams or buggies. It also emphasises the need to maintain free-flowing traffic. What it does not appear particularly concerned with is protecting the walking environment for all pedestrians. Walking seems to remain the downtrodden mode to be endured. Still, there is the opportunity, at least for views to be expressed, and we should take that opportunity. My personal view is that anything less than a nationwide ban, as in Scotland, degrades the importance of walking as a means of stepping out of the pandemic with the hope of achieving the real change we need. And talking about real change, I don't know how many of you watched, as I did, the BBC documentary on Sunday narrated by Sir David Attenborough. It was called Extinction, The Facts. According to one media report this week, it left viewers terrified and angry. And that pretty much sums up how I feel now. We're facing an existential crisis. This is not just Sunday night armchair drama we can switch off from and return to the daily grind on Monday morning. It's the reality we now face for the rest of our lives. Systemic change is essential and urgent, especially in transport. We need walking to be unashamedly prioritised as part of a movement to tread more lightly environmentally. Some continuation, you might say, of the Live Local, Act Global experience that many have had through this pandemic. Well, I want to conclude my introductory remarks by referring to a short, and you'll be pleased to know, a more uplifting article published on the 25th of August and written by Eric Weiner in the US, which he called "Why Walking is the Ideal Pandemic Activity." He observes, "For me, walking is the perfect pandemic activity, socially distanced, yet not socially isolated. I wave to a neighbour or a postal carrier, engaging in one of those precious micro encounters that the pandemic has largely robbed us of." He goes on to say, "Walking is about more than walking, and always has been. Walking soothes, walking inspires and sharpens the mind. The act of walking is democratic, although the access to safe walking isn't always guaranteed." He quotes Edward Abbey, "You can't see anything from a car. You've got to get out the goddamn contraption and walk." And perhaps most important for our discussion this afternoon, Eric Weiner notes, "We run from problems, we walk towards solutions." So, with that as my own set of comments, we now turn to our first-rate panel we have with us this afternoon, with anticipation, I think, to hear their views on whether or not walking is downtrodden, why it matters so much, and what we can hope for, or demand indeed, as we emerge from the pandemic. So without further ado, Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Glenn. And that was a brilliant introduction. I really enjoyed that. And I particularly like the walking puns in terms of footnote, step change and downtrodden. You've set the bar high for all of us there. So my name is Susan Claris. I'm a transport planner working at Arup, been with the firm nearly 30 years. And I'm also the Vice President of Living Streets, the UK charity for everyday walking. And I've been a trustee of the charity for the last 4 or 5 years as well. And I want to make 3 brief points as part of my introduction. So the first one is I'm thrilled to bits to be here. I'm delighted to be an event that has the focus on walking. I've been passionate about walking all my life, but I think I only really saw it as being part of my professional life over the last decade or so. For too long, walking wasn't taken seriously as a mode of transport. It was tacked on with the cycling and walking coming at the very end of documents. And it's great now to see walking having more centre stage, being where it belongs. And there has been wider appreciation this year. It is higher up the policy agenda. It is actually getting mentioned, but we are still in a position where cycling dominates the discussions, dominates all the imagery. And I think walking should always come before cycling. It is the footnote, and we need to change that. So that's my first point. My second point is that as transport planners, I think we focus far too much on the journey to work, the commuting journey, and peak hour movement. And this means that local journeys, which are the majority of trips, 2/3 of trips are under 5 miles, get neglected, and also shopping and leisure, which are still 50% of the trips we make are for shopping and recreation and leisure purposes. Commuting is only about 15% of the trips. So as transport planners, we need to focus or refocus so we include these local journeys which are perfectly suited to walking, and I think that would help to give walking more prominence. And then the third point I want to make is that improving walkability by itself is not enough. When we talk about walkability, we might talk about widening footways, we might talk about putting in pedestrian crossings. These things are good things to do, but they are not enough. And I'm increasingly of the view that we need to address what I term as transport gluttony, which is the overconsumption of transport to the detriment of others, chiefly people walking and cycling and people who live in those areas. As an examples of that, I would include footway parking. I would include the increasing use of massively large vehicles in urban areas, SUVs. 1 in 3 vehicle sales now in Europe is an SUV. For engine idling, going through red lights, traveling at inappropriate speeds. And while we let all of these things happen, we will never end up with a good walking environment. So yes, we need to put walking first. We need to focus on local trips and on recreation, shopping, leisure trips, and we need to address transport gluttony. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. And I'm sure we'll wish to come back to this notion of gluttony, but let's move over to Chris to hear your opening salvos, Chris, if I can put it that way.
Thanks, Glenn, and thanks for having me, and hello, everyone. My name is Christopher Martin. I'm an urban designer and planner focusing on the design of streets and spaces and transport. I'm co-founder and director of urban strategy at Urban Movement, which is a practice sort of started to look at the sort of design of complex urban environments where transport meets everyday life. I'm also on the executive committee of the Urban Design Group and a trustee of Living Streets alongside Susan, and also on the United Nations Planning and Climate Action Group. I think my point today, I really want to talk about people. We as human beings are natural walking animals. It's why our bodies have evolved to look like this, and it's why as a species we can efficiently cover an enormous amount of ground walking, and why we find it so relaxing and cathartic, but only in the right circumstances. I think that the pace and scale of urban development has sometimes really lost sight of this. And some of the communities that are designed and streets that are built do not see walking as essential or even useful. Something which I reflected on during lockdown, however, was how our enforced local lives reignited a sense of community, which is only infrequently rolled out in normal times and normally at times of celebration. Because we were all doing things very locally, it meant that for the most part, we all walked or wheeled to where we were going because we didn't have to consider the least worst way to go long distances. And this meant that we met our neighbours, we spoke to our neighbours, and community spirit was never stronger, as Glenn mentioned. In this respect, lockdown inevitably allowed some people to experience the benefits of walking around their community, but it also highlighted the huge inequalities that exist in places. Living in a well-planned urban area means that one can comfortably walk to almost everything they need. But in areas planned around the car, it's simply not the case, placing parts of the UK, to my mind, in transport poverty, with access to goods and opportunity being predicated on owning a car. Going forward, I think a green and just recovery is the only way we can dig ourselves out of this hole. We need to put in place a system that safely and equitably connects people, everyone in society, to the jobs and city services they need. So building back better, to me, means understanding that more space for walking is the innovative solution that will help our cities rebuild and restore our economy whilst protecting lives, cutting dangerous pollution, and at the same time increasing community spirit and local pride, indeed encouraging us all to buy local and maybe even forget Amazon.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. And I think the word equity leaps out there and clashes head on with gluttony, it seems to me. It's about rebalancing and redistributing opportunity and entitlement. So yes, things to come back to. But Hannah, over to you next, please.
Hi, I'm Hannah, and thanks also for for letting me be on your panel. I feel really privileged today. I'm one of the co-founders at Go Jauntly. We're an award-winning walking and wayfinding and nature connection app. We are one of Transport for London's partners, and we work with various local authorities across the UK. We won the Mayor of London Civic Innovation Challenge for active travel, and we recently launched a new feature called Nature Notes, which is a smartphone-based green prescription which can bring about clinically significant improvements in mental health by helping urban dwellers connect with nature when they're out and about walking. So if I could pitch to government, transport specialists and urban and town planners everywhere today, hi, hopefully you're all listening, but these are the things I want to say. We have a growing mental health, inactivity and obesity crisis, which has now been exacerbated by COVID-19. Walking is fun, free, and one of the easiest ways to be more active and become happier and healthier. Urban nature is also a refuge. We don't have to travel to far-flung places to benefit from nature connectedness. During peak lockdown, our daily sanity walk became a lifeline for many, and the country's chief medical officer, Chris Whitty, stated that being outside in a park is a very good thing to do. He's basing this on hundreds of scientific studies and quantitative research across continents that show the profoundly positive consequence of exposure to green space. The Victorians first established parks and cast them as urban lungs, viewing these green spots as a key part of the infrastructure of any city or town. Despite all of this, investment in urban parks and protecting green spaces is in considerable decline. Walking and nature connection is not equitable. Chris mentioned it. People in deprived areas and underserved communities have less access to gardens and other green spaces, and by extension, its mental and physical health benefits. This has disastrous consequences for our population. Nature is not a luxury, it's a must-have. On top of this, people who live and work in the UK's most deprived areas suffer from higher rates of air pollution, yet clean air and quieter streets is less consolation for people who have to week struggle to put food on the table and to make ends meet. New evidence via Waze has shown that in the London suburbs, COVID is pushing people back into cars. Cars suddenly seem like even more of a sanctuary right now, even though it's said to be up to 7 times more polluted inside a car compared to walking or cycling. I believe we've run out of time. There is a dire human and planetary need for a new relationship with nature. Science shows that nature connectedness leads to pro-environmental behaviours. If walking and active travel is a priority outcome, it should have a priority level of funding which reflects this. We need to invest large sums of money in walking infrastructure, invest in the urban greening of neighbourhoods by planting trees, protecting existing parks and green spaces, creating more, and giving out financial incentives to local communities to help green up their streets to make the urban walking experience more attractive. And I really think we need to do it right now.
Well, thank you, Hannah. Hard to pick out the headline from those introductory remarks, but I think one that stood out, apart from the critical mental health connection, is this perhaps contradiction that we're saying on the one hand, or at least Scotland is saying, it really is top of the hierarchy, and yet it doesn't translate, not specifically in Scotland, but generally as top of the funding priorities, which maybe is that a contradiction? Perhaps we'll come back to that. Thank you. And now we go on location. Remarkably in this panel discussion, over to Pete.
Hello everyone. Yes, my name's Pete. My surname is Zanzotera. Most people know me as Pete Z. I am in the park opposite my house. And during lockdown, I was aware of lots of people saying, oh, well, you can work from the garden. And lots of us live in terraced houses that don't have gardens. And this park opposite my house is common land. I am a trustee of Armley Common Rights Trust. We keep this park going for local people and anybody that wants it. I think one of the things that really excites me about this panel discussion is listening to people like Hannah, because walking is in its infancy. We are learning things and changing things every minute. When I came into post, I worked for the Active Travel Commissioner, Dame Sarah Story in Sheffield City region. One of the things we needed to do was start to put walking on the map, in terms of the transport map. We now have a minimum footway width of 2 meters. It all came out of Sarah being a Paralympic athlete and us saying, well, we cannot engineer spaces that are inaccessible. And what is the accessibility need for a pavement? And quite a lot of people have to walk accompanied by somebody else. And that led us to look at cars. Everybody in a car has a space next door to them for somebody to sit. You know, that we have designed a roadway where everybody accepts that somebody has somebody sitting next to them. Why is it so inconceivable that on a footway we should walk with somebody right next to us, or we should cycle with somebody right next to us? And that sort of led us to change what we're doing. Another thing that came in early in the piece was time delays and deflection. We have transport appraisal systems that measure, and I know Susan said walking, travel to work, and they measure to the second the delay and deflection, and they change signal timings so that each second is optimized for people in vehicles. And the people at the bottom of the pile, the people who are walking, nobody ever thinks about that. It's only now during lockdown that we have begun to get some of my authorities to put straight across crossings where there were centre islands. Centre islands are the most polluted, dangerous part of the road, yet we think that's a great place for people to walk if they can't get across both carriageways. That is not a great place. So time delays and deflection, we're beginning to develop ideas on that. I think the other key thing for me to say is when we started to write our active travel implementation plan, the obvious thing to us was the amount of short journeys in South Yorkshire that are done by car. 26% of journeys under 500 metres are done in a car in South Yorkshire. Now that is absolutely ridiculous. It's over half of journeys under 2 kilometres. When you ask people what is the most popular way of travelling, they scratch their heads, they say the car, the bus, and everybody forgets that the most used mode of transport every day in every city in this land is walking. And that it's really important that we begin to measure things and equate things to the majority form of transport. The last thing I wanted to mention was when we started looking at walking, and I know some people on the call will vehemently oppose this, we suddenly realized that running was completely left out. Nobody measures running, and it looks like something like 1% of people run to work. And when we looked at running, we came up with a different priority because people run for distance, and quite often people walk for distance. And if you're walking for distance or running for distance, the kind of experience and where you cross the road can be maneuvered to be the nicest place and not to be the most horrible congested junction. So that's why I say we're in our infancy. We're beginning to learn things about planning that we never thought of before. Certainly in transport planning. I think in planning, people know about place, and I know we've got Chris on the call. So that's pretty well all of it from me. There you go, Glenn. And here's the park.
Fantastic, and we're all envious of your quality of your internet connection. Yeah, I think you touch upon appraisal, which of course is a moot point. I was rummaging around in appraisal guidance or analysis guidance for walking versus for motorized modes. And I think one of the things acknowledged is it's notoriously difficult to try and forecast what's going to happen with walking, but it just feels as though it's trying to use a hammer when you need a screwdriver to understand the issue to me. But again, rich set of issues to come back to. And so last but not least, Natalie, looking forward to your views.
Hi. I'm Natalie Grohmann, and I'm the Active Travel Policy Lead in the Welsh Government. And to answer your initial question, yes, I think walking has been often overlooked in many ways. And I can speak from experience because we are very proud in Wales that we have the Active Travel Act, which has always set out to create a framework basically that allows us to increase levels of walking and cycling, always in that order, walking and cycling in Wales. And yet in any discussion about active travel, since I've been working in this area, you start talking about active travel, the speed with which you end up talking about cycling, or people, whether they are professionals or stakeholders, they start talking about cycling really. is often amazing. You have to pull them back and remind them walking too. And that has been a very common feature, I think, and I'm sure other people have the same experience. But I think the pandemic might just be that little window that kind of helps us to kind of try and ease walking's passage into the consciousness more. And I think the reason why walking isn't so much on everybody's mind and agenda when they talk about active travel is because we're surrounded by walking infrastructure, and people don't normally critically assess it in the same way as a cyclist does when they meet dangerous road conditions. And so, and obviously there's always a rich cycling lobby ready to tell you what they think, whereas with walking, it's not the same. Despite the excellent work that Living Streets do, there is not that large group of people who vocally shout for walking all the time. But, and similarly, if you ask somebody to visualize an active travel scheme, they have a cycling route in mind or a shared use path maybe, but it's very rarely that they would think about something specifically walking related, I think. And but I think the experience, and you have mentioned the levels of walking and cycling during lockdown that have been experienced. I think that's a real opportunity to change this now, because whereas both levels increased, walking levels have gone up. I mean, more than 3 to 4 times the number of people who walked during lockdown and really enjoyed it. And I did a sort of mini survey among my social media network about the kind of experience that people had when walking. And it did come across the points that Hannah made, that it was really, really valued and important. And people found it incredibly enriching. And they didn't just make recreational journeys, they made journeys to local shops. They obviously went Pokemon hunting as well. Mustn't forget that. But whatever motivated them, they really, really enjoyed that experience. And the COVID travel tracker that the DFT run shows also that that has translated in the intention to continue to walk more, which I find really encouraging. And of course, we are now in a situation where it becomes less, as you say, traffic increases, it becomes less cozy and nice. But I think it's still there, that warm feeling about walking that people have. And I think we need to start that to get people, continue to have people excited about it. So was walking upstaged by cycling in this whole thing? I think in the media, most definitely, both old and new media always got very excited about this temporary cycle lanes. But actually, in terms of usage, it definitely didn't. And in terms of I think the schemes that were put forward in Wales, for example, we made temporary measure funding available like it was done in England. And the majority of schemes that were put forward were actually more for benefit of walking. So widened pavements, reduced parking. And yes, there were schemes that were hotly debated and fought over. But a lot of school street kind of initiatives. So a lot of the focus was really on walking. And I think it's easy to overlook that because they are not so headline grabbing. But I think there is a little bit of a groundswell of support, and it's just important to keep hold of that. So as I said, in Wales, we have got the Active Travel Act, and that is requiring local authorities to plan integrated walking and cycling networks for all their towns. And they have to review these over the next year. So I think we have got a really good opportunity in Wales to try and, kind of, get that feedback from people about what is stopping them, what's making it difficult, and try and get those plans in place to improve the routes. So, and that's my positive outlook.
Thank you, Natalie. And I'm intrigued. I'm paraphrasing, I know, but I'm intrigued by this notion that there's almost such a pervasive sense of the opportunity to walk that we can't see the importance of it. Whereas, as you say, new cycling infrastructure has been hard fought for and, relished when it's won. Whereas the pavements, no matter how deteriorated they are or non-existent in places, there's an overall sense of, well, of course, get on and walk. It might be unpleasant, but there's nothing stopping you in many cases. What I'm struck by listening to all of your introductions and aside from the richness of issues, are two related points. One is, particularly as I listen to Hannah, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And I think surely this can't be the case for walking. You know, it's good for mental health, it's good for physical health, social interaction, it's a great leveler. It's what we need to tackle the environmental challenges. Does it therefore sound too good? And, you know, is there something wrong in there? Because everything you've all said, I appreciate we didn't select someone for the panel who was anti-walking. Maybe we've missed something, but everything you've set out makes absolute sense to me. There's little in there that's particularly controversial, I would venture to suggest. So it leads to the question, why then are we really not seeing walking front and center if it sounds so good and we want more of it? Maybe I'll come back straight first to you, Natalie, from a government perspective. Perhaps it is, as you say, walking and cycling. Do you see it from a Welsh context as being very much the top of that hierarchy in all respects?
Well, we certainly, like Scotland, we say they are at the top of the hierarchy, and we have increased funding, so we are making it more. I mean, it's still not at the same level as roads investment, but we definitely have boosted funding massively over the years. So we are trying to recognize that hierarchy in more than just fine words. And as I say, through these planning duties, we are forcing local authorities to give this really good thought to, you know, how they get people to make those everyday journeys, as Pete said, not the, or I think several mentioned it, not the radial routes necessarily, but actually the local networks that you need to get to school, to get to the shops, to, you know, to go to the GP. So it is really about just pushing that importance up the political agenda. But I do find with air quality and decarbonisation, there's a whole range of topics that kind of push us down this route, and it really helps and elevate kind of the debate, I think, and open, you know, open minds that might have been more closed before.
Yeah, and I note in our audience, Martin Peretti's raised the point in relation to pavement parking, that it's not just cars that are an obstacle on our pavements. And I wonder, Pete, from your perspective in Sheffield, I mean, my sense is that if we're really prioritising walking as the top of the hierarchy, that has to run through everything we do like a stick of rock, not just in the transport sector, but, you know, for an urban or rural authority as a whole, to recognise that it's, you know, it overlaps between different responsibilities. Do you see that as an issue in very much on the ground terms, that even if we got rid of pavement parking, there are other things that are encroaching on that priority for walking?
There's loads of it, you know. Highway regs say that if you put guardrailing in, which God help us, we shouldn't be putting in, it has to be spaced 1/2 metre back from the curbside. So immediately you've lost a chunk of space. Poles, posts, A-boards. I thought Edinburgh was fantastic at getting rid of A-boards, and so that when we put our 2 metre wide available footway, that's available footway, not street furniture cluttered footway. So it's a never-ending stream of rubbish that as designers ends up on the footway. And I think good designers are getting better at this. They have a walking zone and a zone for furniture. But furniture, and I very much know what has been brilliant in London is the move EV charging points off the footway into the roadway. You know, that every single roadworks that I see locally, where do they stick the signs for the roadworks? Ram bam in the footway, even if the footway's not affected. You know, and the footway is a litter zone. And I very much know what Dame Sarah Story said to me when she'd done some pre-work for the Tokyo Olympics. And she said that vehicles parked on the footway in Tokyo are litter. We litter our footway with any amount of rubbish. So some of it's temporary, some of it is permanent, and we really do need to get out and clean up all these posts and poles and everything that's all over the way.
Yeah. And Hannah, as I say, you not to suggest others didn't as well, but you, in a very impassioned way, put across the importance of addressing mental health as well as obesity in terms of some quite endemic problems that we have, as well as connecting with nature and the inequalities. So is there a sense that this is all sounding too good to be true? I mean, do you see that, what's the pushback to your set of remarks which prevents us from investing and prioritizing much more visibly than we do?
I think the problem lies with the fact that people believe that walking won't make you any money, like it doesn't contribute to GDP. When we're a self-funded startup, and we went and spoke to a few investors, and they all pretty much laughed me out of the room and saying, a walking app, you're not going to make any money. It's not going to make any money. It's not going to make any difference. It's, like, that's the kind of like attitude that I got back. And having spoken to sort of various local authorities and different organizations, the money all comes from like really different places. Sometimes it's from DFT, sometimes it's from Public Health England, sometimes it's from Sport England. There's no joined up element to it. And I think the other thing is like it being quite difficult to establish like the return on investment for walking. So in the news recently, Sir James Bevan from the Environment Agency called for more healthcare investment to be diverted into environmental projects, including things like expanding community access to green space, which we know would encourage walking. It could save 2.1 billion a year in treatment costs for a range of mental, physical health issues associated with poor environment, from anxiety, depression to respiratory illnesses. The Wildlife Trust also found that actually green prescriptions, and I don't know if everyone knows what a green prescription is, but it's basically prescribing walking or nature connection gardening, that kind of thing. Research by Leeds Beckett University and the Wildlife Trust suggested that for every £1 invested in health or social needs projects that connect people to nature, there's a £6.88 social return. So I think like these are few and far between, like these kind of statistics, but we need to get it on paper and show the return on investment in walking for it to get the investment it deserves. Like, I think there was a famous quote from someone, I can't remember their name, but they basically said if walking was a wonder drug, it would be the most expensive drug in the world. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And actually, as Natalie was talking, it really struck me that, of course, you can sell expensive shoes, but actually the problem, walking's biggest problem is there isn't a vehicle involved. And therefore you can't sell this mobility, or at least you can sell it, and it needs to be sold in much more inventive ways. And I think Go Jauntly's, looking at that route way, and some of you will know I've talked about walking as a service. There are cleverer ways than just directly selling units of mobility, which we're so used to. But that's a nice link across, because I want to bring Chris and Susan in from the kind of introductory remarks. So what does make money are SUVs, which kind of squarely hits the gluttony point, and indeed creates the tensions between maintaining free-flowing traffic and not becoming litter on the pavements. And meanwhile, Chris's voice loud and clear is saying, what about social inequity in all of this? So same question to both of you, I guess. How do you see us resolving this tension between a sense of entitlement supported by private sector interests in selling mobility and a desperate need to recognise and address social inequality, which walking could help achieve?
I can jump in. I think
you go first.
I think a huge part of this is we have to stop subsidising the things which are damaging to cities. I think lots of reports are through the ages have called for us to remove subsidies on car use. We know that every man, woman, child, if you drive or not, is subsidising vehicle use by about £900 a year. It's exactly the same as we saw with plastic bags in the UK. We never used to think about taking our own bag to the supermarkets. Now we do, because someone now charges us 10p. And it's as simple as that. We have to stop subsidising things which cause us damage, and we have to start move that subsidy onto things that we want people to do. And again, it comes down to infrastructure as well. And our infrastructure has to invite the behaviours that we want people to undertake. If you're going to school and you're taking your child to school and you have to walk down an empty street full of empty driveways, get to this massive road, go through one of those chicane crossings, wait for the green man, all the fumes, it's just a miserable experience and no one wants to do it. So actually, we have to connect land use planning and transport far more effectively. and actually then start to develop this infrastructure which invites people to do the things which are good for society and the environment.
But do that in the context of a lot of people indulging in gluttony. So Susan, how can you come back on that in a sense?
Yeah, I think this is where it all becomes tricky, because you were saying earlier, if this is such a good thing, why is it not already happening? And I think, you know, people will be okay about talking about improving walking and cycling. You know, it's sort of that's all right, but that will normally come at the expense of someone else. It's reallocating road space. We've got a finite use of space, and decisions have to be made about priorities. And yes, we can have our modal hierarchies and we have walking at the top. When it actually comes to taking away a parking space, often those modal hierarchies sadly seem to pale into the background. And I think we're seeing this, I said, with some of the low traffic neighborhoods now. So for me, the fundamental things are 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in urban areas. I think there should be a system of national road pricing to actually help people to think about their decisions, particularly regarding, you know, shorter car journeys. And you know, we do need more controls, and we need more controls on parking and taking out parking in city centres. And in terms of the benefits of the economy that we were talking about, you know, it's starting to be accepted now, or realised, that people who walk to high streets spend more money than people who drive there. But for most people, the most important thing is still having free parking or having space where people can park. And I think we've got into the situation where motorists assume that they can go wherever they want to go and do whatever they want to do, and that isn't questioned. And, you know, if I look at my own borough, Islington, you know, if you've got a low emission vehicle, if it's a pure battery electric vehicle, you can park on the street for free. If you've got a bicycle and you want to park it in one of the cycle hangars, it costs over £100 a year. You know, and I think the wrong incentives are going out there, and we're seeing this played out really strongly in some of the arguments that are taking place over low traffic neighbourhoods at the moment. And it's a constant source of bafflement and despair, the way that, you know, cars are marketed now, and the, you know, the pop-up ads that we see on Twitter for SUVs, you know, they're your best friend, you know, they're who you talk to, they do all of these things. There was well, I shouldn't say ridiculous, but in my mind ridiculous Land Rover ad about sort of taking the urban safari through Brixton and the best way to see and experience what the city evolves. And it's because people, I think, just have so much of their personality in, you know, in terms of what their car is, and they're not willing to give it up.
I mean, and interestingly, Kate Conto in our audience is very much picking up on the temporary reallocation of road space and the sense of authorities losing their nerve in the face of opposition. And she asks, you know, how can we support them in holding that nerve and not giving way to the pressure from motorists? Because it really has felt to me over the last weeks and months that, you know, our street space has become a battleground. And it strikes me, you know, looking at the notions of people suffering change or loss, where you go through the stages of denial, anger, resignation, and then acceptance, that we have been in a period of denial where people have been happy to ignore the need for change and the priority for active travel and walking especially. And now, when we've had the opportunity with the pandemic to really thrust that need and opportunity for change into our built environments, we've moved from denial into anger, because it has the prospect of becoming a reality. So, you know, to Kate's question in the audience, and open to all our panel, what would be one thing that we could do or do more of that might really help our local authorities hold their nerve at this critical juncture? Maybe Susan, since you've got the mic first from your last response, and then we'll pass across.
Yeah. I think it comes down to showing support. I mean, the difficulty is it's the silent majority who are for these things and the vocal minority who are against. And there was the recent YouGov survey that showed that for every person who was against these schemes, there were 6.5 people for these schemes. And I said, seen it very strongly played out in my own borough with, ironically, people marching on the streets to close them, to complain about streets being closed. And the sort of people that are doing there's organised groups coming in. It doesn't tend to be local residents, but there's also a lot of misinformation and concern about what the impact of these schemes are. And I noted one of the comments was saying we should have a sort of a UK organisation to bring everyone together for walking. I think it needs to go beyond that. So again, I said, if I look at groups in my own local area. We've got cycling groups, we've got clean air groups, we've got parent groups, we've got neighbourhood groups, we've got walking groups, and a lot of them actually all want the same outcome. It isn't about necessarily walking, it's about having streets that are healthy, safe places to be. And I think if there was a way of uniting all of those groups who actually want the same outcome, it doesn't matter which perspective you're coming from, but the more we divide those groups up, the less their voices are heard. But I think, if we could express more strongly the desire we have for our streets, and I said my own borough, we're in a position where only a quarter of households actually have a car. It's incredibly low car ownership, and we're still seeing this enormous, very vocal opposition to such schemes. So I think we need to demonstrate that political support. The difficulty is it seems to be easier to express objection than it is to express support.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, I think, in this, as we know from psychology, the difference between experiencing loss and gain. We sense loss more extremely. So I think where, motorists, not that we should assume people are only motorists, but where motoring advocates see a sense of loss, they are motivated to become more vocal than perhaps the prospect of some gain in an improved sense of walkability.
It's hard to campaign for something that you haven't yet got.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I guess the challenge is how we can overcome that. Chris, I mean, you're living and breathing urban design, so I'm guessing the prospect of this tactical urbanism and reallocation of road space was a great high point from a career point of view. But so how are you experiencing the frustration of this battleground, and what advice would you give or help to local authorities?
I think Susan's point about people not being able to argue for something they can't see is a hugely important one. And I think it's testament to the importance of trialing schemes and getting them out there, but in a way that actually allows people to experience them in their full benefit as well, which I think is important. I mean, I struggle to see any arguments against these type of schemes other than self-interest and nostalgia. And I think there's simply no place for nostalgia in the design of our streets and cities. I think in cities before this crisis, we faced a number of critical crises, which actually have serious impacts on the human race. And I think we have to be incredibly scientific about how we allocate space in cities and only prioritize the things that yield the greatest return in fighting these. And to that point, it is that political boldness, it is that political strength to actually to highlight what we actually need to do, and then take it out, because it's the fact that something is there in the street does not mean it's right. I mean, our behaviours are influenced because of how we found a place for a certain amount of time, and then over time it becomes our culture. It's like, all these cities around the world, which it's a car city. It's like, well, that's only because we took a decision at one point to make it a car city, and I think now is the time for us to make another decision, and make this a walking city.
Yeah. And I wonder, Peter and Natalie, perhaps just briefly moving to more of a public sector perspective, how are you finding it to some extent on the front line, as you're kind of caught in the interface between protecting what we've got and trying to advocate for what we could have?
Yeah, I mean, I'm one step removed, obviously. I'm the local authorities on the front line and we are sitting behind them. But I do find, so in for example, one of the key battlegrounds often is the, on high street kind of measures, is how traders view the prospects. I mean, they're obviously already suffering at the moment. So anything that they think could impact further on any footfall or trade in their area is really, really controversial, obviously, for them. So I think what helps there is, waving the pedestrian pound at them, the report, so it's not necessarily going to do it. But, we've got examples where in one small local town in Wales, they have pedestrianized during the lockdown, and it's fine. It's actually going, footfall is up, takings are up. That's a really good example then that you can then take into the conversation with the next high street. So I think that's kind of what we need to build up, like really tangible examples, not fantastic, beautiful quantitative analyses that I love, obviously, but some example that they can immediately directly relate to.
Yeah, no, very good. I think that speaks very loud and clearly to me, and relates back to this point about Susan's point about the challenge of arguing for something that you can't see, and Chris's point that you've reinforced really with, well, let's give them sight of something which, even if they've not yet got it, they almost feel that they're going to miss out by not being given it. Yeah. So maybe it is a communications issue as much as anything, and as you say, Natalie, not just numbers. Pete, you are perhaps our most front line from a public sector, and then I'll come quickly to Hannah after that. But what's been your experience over the last few weeks?
I think the key thing for us is to find our brave politicians and back them. We have and change who we're listening to. That schemes are getting sunk by a small number of highly motivated older people, quite often, who drive a lot, who are mourning the loss of their parking spaces, and our politicians quite often listen to those people because they're the only people who are shouting loud enough, you know, and that we probably need to move all of our consultations so that it has a far bigger audience. It goes to where people are and doesn't sit in a dusky town hall with plans with people that drive to the consultation. You know, that we really need to, I know this sea change is happening. You know, Councillor Clyde Lokes of Waltham Forest is probably the most popular councillor in the whole of the UK at the moment, in terms of this kind of active travel agenda, in that he's trumpeted as somebody who saw this off. And I think the other part of this is that those councillors who are making restricting decisions and withdrawing things, they're not going to last quite as long as the ones who are brave. So we have to change the way we consult. We need to back and help our local elected members be brave, because we had a fantastic example in Sheffield of a piece of infrastructure that was really heavily criticised. It stayed in, and it has allowed us to plan the next piece of infrastructure, which is substantive and much better planned. And so I think we need some brave elected members that are prepared to have this out, and for us to change the way we consult. A lot more online. The interactive map in Sheffield City region has thousands of comments and lots of subscribed people, so that we can wave that at people.
I'm going to attempt now a very brave, ambitious segue from what you've been saying, Pete, across to Hannah. And the segue will go via John Cartledge in the audience. Since you've mentioned about who shouts loudest, John points out that there are millions of dogs whose bark deserves to be heard. And incidentally, I'm told the cost of buying a new puppy during lockdown has gone up 3 times because of the demand for this new living local experience. And I'm wondering, Hannah, whether you could just share a little bit with us about Go Jauntly, because I'm not sure everyone will know about your innovation, and perhaps just say briefly a little bit about why you think its moment might be well timed as an innovation.
Okay, yeah, thanks for asking. I read that one about dogs barking and it just completely went over my head. I don't know if I'll be able to answer that one. But yeah, so Go Jauntly was born out of a frustration of like not being able to find good places to walk, despite like living in a city that's 47% green space, like chained to our desks all day and not really getting out and about. And then we read all this evidence around how nature's good for you physically and mentally, and all of these amazing reports that the likes of TfL, Living Streets, Ramblers had written. And we realized that actually there wasn't something that actually kind of compelled us to go outside and go walking. So we wanted to make walking a pastime again. And that's the kind of angle that we've gone at. And since then, we've built lots of different features. But the core sort of objective of Go Jauntly is that you can open the app wherever you are, and you'll be able to find tailored walks to your location, which you can sort, filter, view based on like accessibility requirements, whether you've got a pram, whether there's public transport there. And the idea is that it's photo-led routes. That's basically to help build on this sort of like anticipation of like having an amazing experience, and also like breaking down some of the barriers to walking, so you can see if it's going to be muddy, if it's going to be steep, if there's going to be a loo, if there's going to be rest stops. And so that's where the sort of idea was born. And since then, we've added lots of cool features to try and bolster that walking experience and really make it fun and interactive, and kind of come at it like walking first, and with privacy in mind as well. So we don't track you every step by step, but we have really good indications, algorithms that can calculate how far you get on a journey. And we've actually just won some funding from Innovate UK as part of the business response to COVID, to create these hyper-local dynamic walking routes that you can take from your doorstep or wherever you are, and it will send you on like a greenest trip, circular trip, or a greenest A to B trip. And so we're going to be launching that as part of our sort of version 2 green prescription shortly. So that's really exciting.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I do get a sense, you know, that there's a lot to be optimistic about insofar as we've got various building blocks to really, you know, create this potential renaissance in walking. And I think Natalie's mentioned, you know, some of the numbers she's seen in terms of lockdown behaviour. But if the National Travel Survey is to be believed in England, notwithstanding some methodological changes, you know, there's been a sharp increase in walking trip rates under 1 mile. And I think if we're seeing more dog walkers, and more people, you know, working from home, then the question is, can we experience our built environment and natural environment and see the richness of it through the eyes of Go Jauntily and similar tech innovations, which perhaps will start to connect to the sense of UK PLC and industrial strategy type thinking that seems also to be in the background, influencing the overall mood in mobility. Okay, we've been picking off some of the questions from our live audience, but several of you submitted some questions and comments in advance of the session, which have been shared with our panel. So I promised there'd be an opportunity for each panel member to spend a couple of minutes just picking out 1 or 2 of those questions and issues and feeding back on those. So Chris, perhaps we could come to you first of all. What caught your attention?
Yeah, there was a question about, shall I repeat the question? Is that the most helpful thing to do?
Yeah, if you like, yes. And who posed it, if you've got that detail?
I don't have that, I'm afraid.
Not to worry.
It was a question about sort of how walking literally gets mentioned at the end of this sustainable modes in most urban policy documents, and usually in a very, very vague terms when it comes to developing interventions. The question asked, is it the most accessible of all sustainable modes, and what is needed to address this imbalance? I think that we've touched around a few of these topics already, and I think the first thing that struck me is sort of the 2 main problems of walking and wheeling. Firstly, we all do it without really thinking, and secondly, as Hannah mentioned really well, there's very little scope for people to sell you stuff before you actually go out and do it. And I think this is at the root of the problem. Why it's always mentioned, but people have a really hard time conceptualizing what good walking infrastructure looks like. And I think and because of this, we accept so much when we're walking and wheeling. I think if you take the idea of you're driving along a pothole-ridden street, you know, you can probably make the front page of a local newspaper on a slow day if you complain enough. But if you're cycling on the surface is awful, you're definitely going to get loads of retweets on Twitter. But if you're walking along a pavement and the surface is undulating every 5 meters for driveways and the pavement just stops to allow cars easy turns into side streets, most of us just get on with it and we accept it. And I think the key thing, as far as I'm concerned, that we need to start thinking about is that word infrastructure and walking infrastructure. And this infrastructure really has to prioritize the movements of people walking and wheeling over cycling. And cycling infrastructure in turn has to prioritize the needs of cycling movements over vehicle movements. And we've spoken about the modal hierarchy, which is in every street design guide under the sun. But it's essential to actually start conceptualizing this and building it. And I think equally not accepting it when it's not delivered.
Yeah. So I think, again, returning to the notion that seems to me that the hierarchy is a principle, but not as readily seen as a practice in its very true sense of the word, as you rightly say, Chris, particularly when it comes down to the nuts and bolts, really, of good quality infrastructure. Okay, Susan, what caught your attention from questions from the audience?
Thank you. Yeah, it was a question from Jenny Cook at Network Rail, and she made reference to the recent report actually that Arup has done with Sustrans called Cycling for Everyone. And that was looking at underrepresented groups in cycling. And I think if on the cycling, we've sort of moved from measuring how many kilometres of cycleway we put in to counting the number of people who are using it, and now looking in more detail to see who those people are and critically who those people aren't. And I said, if TfL has sort of interpreted inclusion as being sort of step free for many years and realised now they need to broaden that. So our report was looking at women, older people, people from BAME backgrounds, people with a disability and people from deprived areas. And the particular question was, what do we know about access to safe and convenient walking routes, pavements or crossing points? And I would say is we don't know enough, but I think the key thing is knowing more about the people who aren't currently walking, many of whom fall into those same categories that I just said for cycling. And our report there really focused on three things: about how we needed improved diversity in governance and decision making and in policy making. That applies to walking, I think, as much as cycling. How we need better places which are inclusive. And that will include things like longer crossing times. We tend to design in our own image, and if we can sprint across the road in 6 seconds, we think that everybody can. So we need to think outside ourselves, and we need better support for people for walking and cycling. And that can come down to things like how you cope with fear of harassment. It isn't all down to infrastructure. A lot of this is about behaviour. It's about expectations. And there's been some really great work done by Living Streets looking at, particularly for older people. There was a case study done up in Edinburgh, and it was a sheltered housing, and outside the pavement was really cracked and people were tripping. And there was a period of nearly 20 years where they tried to improve the surface quality of the footway, didn't really know the right channels to go through, and it was through Living Streets engaging with them and actually then approaching members, seeing what can be done. But a lot of that was the expectation, well, it is as it is, what can I do about it, or not even thinking it can be improved. So I think there's an awful lot here about culture and about experience and about expectation. And I think going back to the Cycling for Everyone, we know cycling is dominated by a very certain demographic, which is sort of males 20 to 50, generally white, generally professional. And that's why cycling gets all the attention. And I think that is a key difference between cycling and walking. If you picture a cyclist in your head, you will picture someone very different than if you picture somebody walking in your head. And I think in terms of we need to know more, and that's what will help make it higher profile. How often do you see a politician walking?
Yeah, only outside number 10, I think, past the press corps. Yes. Incidentally, I think you've kind of piqued my need to come back to pavement parking just briefly. And you're very entitled as a panel to abstain, but I've been tempted in the past to have a quick straw poll during a chat like this. Quick show of hands, I've declared my interest, I'll put my hand up. How many of you think that there should be a nationwide ban on pavement parking in England? Okay, Natalie's happy for you to abstain. Okay, well, there we are in terms of the audience. Maybe we're preaching to the converted. We don't quite know who's listening, but just in passing, I think that's a clear message. If you believe in a hierarchy, several passionate people on this panel have endorsed that position. Okay, thanks, Susan. And yes, coming to you, Natalie. What took your interest from the questions?
Yeah, I was really interested in a couple of questions that Johnny Ray from Living Streets asked, and the first one around whether and how consultation might need to be different to engage people properly about walking improvements. And I think the answer is definitely it does need to be different, although there are some really, really good examples already. So I think we probably need to do finding especially a lot more of it. So with walking, I think what we find is that engagement works best when it's at scheme level or at quite small scale level, very specific localities. I mean, it's hard enough in any kind of transport topic to engage on a sort of strategic plan, but I think with walking, it's particularly difficult. And so, I mean, I have mentioned the willingness of the cycling kind of community to engage in consultations. And I think most of you will have had the experience that if you advertise an active travel or walking and cycling event, whether virtually or physically, what you find, you have a room with 90% cycling enthusiasts, and their input is really, really valuable and important. But they drown out the other voices, and they can also be quite intimidating for other people. So I think we do need to find different ways of engaging on walking rather than just our sort of, village hall kind of gatherings. So I think there are really good examples throughout schools, school route audits, community street audit, really, tangible kind of conversations around very specific areas and try and work out what are the issues and what can resolve them. So I think that's probably the way forward. It's quite a lot of work. And so I think that's probably a key issue, how you can resource that kind of deep engagement that we'll need in lots of places and all at the same time, ideally. So I think working with third sector partners to try and maybe do some of that for you might be a way forward. But another issue obviously to bear in mind is that involving disabled people in these processes is extremely important, so that any routes that we are improving or creating are really suitable for all people. And of course, at the moment during COVID, consultation engagement is generally more difficult and harder. It's not out of the question that you can still do out in the street audits, things like that. But obviously, we also need really good online engagement tools, I think, that meet needs of a variety of users so that they can engage properly on what needs to be done. And yes, I think we all need to probably focus our efforts a lot more on how we engage with people about walking.
I'm very taken by your point about cyclists can be intimidating in engagement sessions. I'm very struck by a sense that, very sadly to my mind, as a researcher going back some years, cycling really wasn't a topic that had much research attention or funding. And therefore cyclists were united in this being an injustice. And then my sense was that once cycling got prioritized as a research topic, suddenly there was infighting amongst the cycling fraternity because there were different versions of cycling that they wanted to hear loudest. And now as we move into a broader active travel environment, very sadly, we've seen, there's that sense that it's cyclists versus pedestrians as opposed to active travel versus the status quo of motorized mobility. And it feels as though we're being divided and conquered in a sense from an active travel perspective. Hannah, what did you take out from the questions beforehand?
I've got loads, so I don't know if I'm going to have time to go through all of it. But just picking up on your point just now, I think everyone has this sort of sense of entitlement, don't they? So pedestrians feel entitled over runners, cyclists feel entitled over drivers, drivers feel entitled over cyclists. We're all just like selfish. But anyway, going back to some of the questions that I found quite interesting, there was one about marketing methods or incentives that would be effective or relevant post-pandemic to creating modal shift to walking. And I think someone has just mentioned about how car manufacturers spent shit ton of money, sorry for swearing, on lobbying government. And how can we compete with that? I've said this before in another session, but I think since Boris is really keen on active travel, we need a Get Brexit Done style campaign from the government or Public Health England or whatever new version that will be. We should be educating the masses because what we're doing now is not working. I'm really surprised that there hasn't been a public health campaign around air pollution and how it's more polluted inside a car compared to outside a car. We've got all these smoking adverts. We had all those AIDS adverts back in the 80s. We've got all these COVID adverts. Why aren't we doing the same when it's almost exactly the same public health crisis? We could have Get Walking Now as the slogan. And we could have diverse audiences walking every day, and they'd be walking in normal clothes and normal shoes. There'd be no Macs, rucksacks or waterproofs anywhere. And yeah, I think that would be really cool. Anyone up for that?
I'm still a little bit dumbstruck by the association you've made between Get Walking Done and Get Brexit Done. I think I'll just say no comment on that for the time being, but I do understand the sentiment.
Yeah, we can change it to Get Walking Now. Is that better?
Okay, that's fine. Thanks, Hannah. Pete, what did you take from the pre-questions?
Well, there's only one that I'm going to address here because there were loads of them. My friend Ruth Gilletley bemoaned the fact that we didn't have a public health specialist on the panel. That's just the way it is. One of the key things about how we set up the Active Travel programme in Sheffield City region was to have a seconded public health specialist helping us write the Active Travel implementation plan. We have an advisory board with the director of the regional integrated care system on it. It's not lost on me that the answer to a lot of our woes is to try and help people walk more. And I just wanted to link that to what we really have to do. In Sheffield City region, it's those very, very short journeys, the 500 meters, the 1 kilometer journey, the journey to the post box to go and post a letter. There's a letter box at the end of this road, and I'm gobsmacked the number of people that drive to it, the people that drive to pick up their local paper. And public health is probably one of the ways that we are going to help those people. My friend that turns up to Parkrun every week until lockdown was diagnosed as being type 2 diabetic, and she was absolutely horrified by this, and she started walking Parkrun, and now she runs it. But that process of taking people and helping them change those very short journeys into being active. I met a man from the bed shop just down the road the other day when I was walking back from selling our car. And he has been diagnosed as type 2 diabetic. He is walking every day. He's lost 9 pounds in a fortnight. So if we link all of this into a kind of realization and action, those really short journeys are the ones we need to stop. If we build low traffic neighborhoods, which I absolutely want us to do, that is the way we're going to choke off those journeys. How do we help those people change their lives? Well, if nothing else, the doctor's saying, you'll know you are classed as obese, you need to do something about your activity. Here's a green prescription. Here's Go Jauntly. Here's your local park. You go for a walk. That would be absolutely fantastic. So in answer to what Ruth said, absolutely, we should have public health specialists. And a big up for Ruth, who in Leeds helped set up the Clean Air Alliance. And I know that Chris and Susan both mentioned this real issue of fragmented groups all campaigning effectively for the same stuff. And we created this lobby group in Leeds, which has begun to change the council's attitude to walking.
Okay, and thanks for that. Relating to, just looking now back to some of the questions that we've been receiving this afternoon, and we've talked about what we'd like to see change and how much change is possible. Jeff Hobbs raises an interesting question, which is there a case for creating a Walking City Ambition Fund, comparing it with a similar fund for cycling in 2013? Do you think we have time on our hands to kind of concentrate in that way on almost demonstration projects of what's possible with walking, or does it need to be much more widespread and heavy hitting now, given the opportunity the pandemic's given us? Perhaps Chris and then Natalie, if you had some reactions on that.
I think it's hugely about the experiential qualities we need to consider as well. I think some of the hugely impactful work that TfL have done is that simple map that shows the walking distances between different tube stations. I think that's had an enormous effect. And I think in the same quality that I think the largest impact on tube use, or one of the massive, or at least the sort of most value for money, is putting countdown clocks on the platform so people knew how long they were waiting. And I think thinking about these kind of experiential qualities is hugely important, because I think the sort of large scale projects in terms of the applying huge amounts of funding will do a lot, but I think it has to be sort of targeted in the fact that we actually have to think about the human experience in how people make their decisions first, and then design for that. Yeah,
no, that makes sense to me. Natalie?
Yeah, my thoughts are that I don't think we need a sort of demonstration, series of demonstration towns, cities for walking. I think it does need to happen everywhere, really, especially as I mean, another question was around how our towns and cities and movement will change post-COVID. And I think it's quite clear that we're probably not going to return to the exact same travel patterns that we've had in the past. There's less of a focus on this big commuting peak into the inner urban areas every day. So we will probably spend much more of our time much more locally because of home working and all those kind of things, opening up completely new opportunities, but also meaning that it's less easy to hit a lot of people with a single transport intervention in the same way that you could maybe with the cycle superhighways or things like that in London. So I think it will have to probably, we need to allocate money to walking in the same way that we do to cycling, or even more. And that means we have mentioned that transport appraisal, transport modeling needs to be changed so that those schemes become fund-worthy, or are deemed fund-worthy. So that's, I think, a key hurdle probably to jump over, that you can make the case for small, very incremental improvements that you often need.
And I'm gonna pass this question over to Susan, but linking to what you've just said, Natalie, making the case, and you mentioned earlier that you, much as you like numbers, you felt, it's examples and case studies that really help understand it. But Pete Dyson in the audience asks really a very, very pragmatic question, which comes back to the system we operate in, where, if we've got evidence-based policy making and investment decisions, the numbers still seem to be needed. So he's asking, how do we fix the research bias that underreports walking, so that trip counts are often underreporting walking involved in multimodal trips? And I'm conscious in the National Travel Survey data, this 30% increase in 3 years in walking trips under a mile could be down to methodological change, even though it's been corrected for. Question to Susan: would it be a good idea for the National Travel Survey to issue step counters and record the number of steps that are taken per day, rather than try and capture these rather elusive, very short trips?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that a lot of the way that we capture data hasn't changed for years or for decades. It's still very conventional. It's the tubes down across the road to record the wheels going over them. We are seeing cycle counters now that pick up some of the trips, but walking does tend not to be picked up. The National Travel Survey still relies on people keeping travel diaries, so it's incredible that we haven't brought those systems more up to date. And now, there's, with people carrying smartphones, there's a lot more data that could be gathered. I fully accept that not everybody has a smartphone, and some people have reluctance about sharing data, but I think there's a lot more. We had a program at Arup called Mobility Mosaic, and that was collecting information to get a more accurate picture of people's travel habits by all modes, and that was really revealing. And we researched it as sort of trials with our own offices to get that more accurate information. But I think we do tend to rely too much on what has happened historically or what we're doing now. I think what we should be focusing more is moving on to an outcome. What future do we want to see? And I think in some of this debate, I don't think we need demonstration towns, because we know what we need to do. We actually had a really vivid demonstration of it earlier in the year during lockdown, which we never thought we would see, when traffic levels were down to their 90/55 level, when air quality was better, when the streets were safer, and we saw how people responded. So we know what we need to do. The difficulty is doing it and the funding for it. And I think in some ways maybe it is too simple. As you will know, Glenn, you get to any discussion on sort of future of urban mobility, and it was electric vehicles, then it was autonomous cars, now it seems to be electric scooters, sort of thing. People like talking about the tech side of it. Actually, what we should be talking about is what streets do we want to see? What impact do we want to see on people? We want people to be healthy. We want people to be happy. We want our retail centres and high streets to be thriving. And I think if we started with that, then we see how do we get there, rather than looking so much on what's happened in the past, because we run the risk of perpetuating that into the future.
Yeah. And yeah, this, in terms of this outcome-based approach. I mentioned in my introduction, of course, we've not perhaps touched upon it in the discussion, but the climate crisis, and it really is a crisis, unless you're in the White House. Perhaps he was referred to as the denier in chief on the news yesterday. But if we take that even with the precautionary principle, we've got an unprecedented crisis for the rest of our lives. We've also got, as Hannah mentioned, the public health crisis. And yet, when we've talked earlier in this session about the importance of experience, for people to experience what they could have, in some respects, the pandemic has given us this 5 to 6 month experience of quieter streets, hearing nature growing back, and the prospect of adding a spring in our steps at the start of our day. And yet, there's still a certain sense that that's still not been enough. We're hearing more about the low traffic neighborhood objections than we are about the pandemic unlocking this newfound passion and recognition for what walking can offer. What do you see the outlook being? If I perhaps ask each of you briefly, looking out over the next 3 to 5 years from this point in the pandemic, do you have great hopes for walking's prospects? Will it still be 20 years behind cycling, Pete, to start off with you?
Well, I think the next 3 to 5 years, I think the next year actually is a massive proving ground where we are, because we're going to start putting in these schemes and we're going to have to deal with the objections and the conversation. And what I do think has happened over the pandemic and the recent weeks and months is that the discussion has got louder and the argument got louder. Now, it has to be that way. We will not get people to change their behavior and change their minds unless there is that friction. We can't do this frictionless. So I see the next year or so to have increasing friction. And there will be some places that have unsuccessful things. We've already seen this. We've seen some bits where parking spaces have been taken out outside shops in some parts of our area, and those parking spaces were immediately reinstated because it was seemed impossible. However, we have seen the pedestrianisation of the centre of Doncaster between 10 and 4 o'clock in our region. That we've actually, that this argument and this friction has to keep going, that people will not change unless they are persuaded to. And the people that persuade them to change are the people in contact on social media, their relatives, the people around them. So I can see us having more and more argument, and that being a good thing, actually, because the behavior change that's needed will need all that.
Okay, no, I love this idea of friction being, well, not necessarily a good thing, but a necessary thing. I'm conscious of time. So what I'm going to do, Pete, actually, is ask if you wanted to add a final sentence, which would be your kind of takeaway from the session. And then I'm going to pass to the other 4 panelists, both with that question about the next 3 to 5 years, but also their closing remarks. So anything else, Pete, that you kind of had in store that you would say has struck you in this discussion, or a message you want to leave the audience with?
No, I'm going to give you the gift of time. I think I've said enough.
Fantastic. Okay, so just in the order I can see on my screen, Chris, I'm going to come to you for your final words.
Thanks very much. I think I'd like to take it up a level and talk about cities, because I think cities are vital to our successful future, and I think the most important thing is we have to work really hard to make them successful for us to be successful. And we've heard so much recently about asking if COVID is going to mean that cities are over. Because the virus sort of finally allows us all to remote everything in from our houses with all this super whiz bang broadband, like Pete's sort of giving us an example of over there in his garden. I think my reflection on is that's a complete nonsense. And I think about Silicon Valley and why that even exists. Why do people go and live and work in that one location when they have all that insane technology? They can just spread out wherever they want and work on Zoom. But it hasn't happened like that. It hasn't worked for them like that, and because it doesn't work. I think it doesn't work because real and inspiring human energy exists when we smash together in crazy places like London. And I think distance and remoteness actually threaten human culture. Cities aren't going anywhere, and I think because cities are essential to society and way too much fun. Cities change, they mutate, and they reform. And I think the opportunity we have right now is to marshal the mutation. We have to shape cities for a more green and just place, to be more green and just. And as I said at the beginning, to allow people to safely and equitably connect to people, to jobs and services, as well as the opportunity. And I think to achieve this, walking has to be at the heart of planning and strategic urban design going forwards.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. That's some wonderful thoughts in my mind from that. Hannah.
Just going to unmute. Oh yeah, so many things, so little time. I really love what Hackney are doing. They've really shown and demonstrated like what you can do in the period of lockdown, and then like the kind of city coming back to life. And I wish as a resident that where I live, they'd follow a similar trajectory. But I think if I was to sort of summarize everything today and like put my stake in the ground, that walking has to be the most attractive option for short journeys in urban areas. We should refuse to say the C word. We should just not say it. Straight away, the C word is cycling, obviously, in case you're wrong, Claire. Straight away, I'm going to say we need to ban private cars at least once a week during the weekend, maybe unless you have a legitimate permit to travel. You know, we're talking like climate emergency. It's all happening right now. We need to do this now. We should make all residential roads no-through roads using modal filters. Roads around every school should be turned into a school street to reduce the school run. We need to make pedestrian crossings and walkways prioritise people over cars now. And it pains me so much that the onus is on pedestrians to avoid polluted streets or awkward places to walk instead of cars avoiding residential areas. You know, this whole Waze, Google, Apple Maps, they should be mandated by government to not enable people to shave 10 minutes off their journey by going around residential streets. And I think they should be sharing that information back with the government. A lot of these organisations had investment from their own governments. They should be giving back and not making billions and destroying the planet at the same time. And I think we need to make driving, not walking, we need to make driving super awkward and frowned upon like smoking is now. Like at the moment, we can only meet like 6 people in the UK. What if you were only allowed to drive 4 times a month without extenuating circumstances or a special permit? Taxing has worked in the past. Like, let's try it. Let's do it. What have we got to lose?
Wonderful. I'm sat here listening, and I'm thinking there will be, and I won't get political on this, but there will be people who are probably not in this session who will say, did you hear those extremist views expressed by this namby-pamby group focusing on walking, and they don't understand the importance of the economy and living our daily lives? And yet, of course, everything you've said to me, Hannah, makes sense, and it makes sense because we are facing an emergency, and tinkering around this system, talking about what walking might become, just isn't good enough anymore.
Yeah, it's a real shame that it's so radical, but you know, like it is becoming politicized now. I was reading the other day that like what Susan was mentioning around the LTNs, like a lot of these Twitter accounts that are trolling councillors have actually only just been opened up, so they've got 0 followers. They've 0 tweets, they just retweet or whatever. And, you know, like it seems to be part of this kind of disinformation system. It's really annoying.
Yeah. Okay, Natalie, you and Susan have got the chance to decide whether we go upbeat or downbeat or realistic on the finish. But yes, over to you, Natalie.
Right. So as I started off, I think there's a real window of opportunity here to capitalize on this as the groundswell of newfound love of walking or rediscovered love of walking. But however, I agree with pretty much everything that Hannah suggested there. I am very worried by this sort of poisoned public discourse that we have touched upon a few times, and what that might do to any ambitious interventions that we might plan. I mean, in Wales, we're embarking on a not actually that radical, but you know, new innovative policy of moving to 20 mile per hour default speed limits in urban areas, or in you know, replacing the 30, and we are going to see how that is going to play out. You know, we think, a silent majority who will support it, but we are also under no illusion that there will be a vocal minority who will make their voices heard. And so, I mean, returning back to what Hannah said earlier about the sort of marketing of this, you know, we are terrible at getting people excited that aren't already fans of walking and cycling, and so are most politicians, unfortunately. So I do think we need these brand ambassadors for walking that are reaching parts of the population that we just can't reach. So I'd love somebody with a very clever marketing brain to come up with good ideas there.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. Well, I know getting quite close to a brand ambassador, if not talking to one directly. Susan, your words, please.
Thank you. And I will end on an optimistic note. I mean, this year I said we have had a glimpse of a transport future we didn't think we would see, and it was a transport future from a walking perspective that was great. I am saddened by the fact that we seem to be letting it slip away. But in terms of the next 3 to 5 years, I think the very fact that we've had this discussion today, that we had 300 people signed up to an event on walking, that people are as passionate about it as we've had, is great. We probably wouldn't have had that 5 years ago. So, you know, I think we are on a trajectory. I do see things changing. I think we need to more clearly articulate the benefits of walking. We all, if whatever our role, whatever our projects, we can add the hashtag and walking to make sure. So we all have a role to play in all of this. And I think, you know, the more that we can get this in the views of politicians, the active travel commissioners have been great about that. But for me, they've had too much of a sporty emphasis. And I think that alienates some people. It'll be really interesting to see who the ambassador for Active Travel England is going to be, and I just hope that they will have a walking focus as well. So I think it's positive. I think we are taking steps in the right direction. I think we need to take more of them. We need to take them more quickly. And for me, the message is walk more.
Thanks, Susan. And we're just about out of time. So my last very brief words, picked out from your own comments. I think we're facing a need for dramatic change ahead. There's going to be lots of friction, and Pete tells us that's a necessary and perhaps even a good thing. I love the phrase from Chris that we will need to marshal the mutation. And of course, that's about high quality comms. And we've got some of the people on our panel who are probably the best in class for being able to communicate and demonstrating that. And not to forget education. Paul Furman in our audience made the last remark, I think, in the chat about, you know, it starts at school. Let's get those children with the right environment to walk to school. It's not sexy and exciting, but it's fundamental. So with that, before I hand back to Brogan, thank you all ever so much as a panel for your passion and time and preparation for this. Thanks to our audience. I hope you've found the hour and a half enjoyable and stimulating and taking something of value from it. And with that, back to Brogan and PTRC.
Yeah, awesome. Just to say thanks so much to the panel. It's a really interesting conversation. Lots of chat going on YouTube. So thank you very much. And 1 month until our next chat, we'll be talking about young professionals. So make sure to tune in